Caring for someone with dementia is not for the faint of heart. How do you guide yourself through it as well as your loved one? Fortunately, my guest Lisa Bricker has been there and shepherds her clients through the challenges she once faced herself. And Lisa will be telling us all about it. Moving your mom or your dad or yourself isn't just about moving things from one place to another. It is much more complicated than that, as are so many things having to do with later life. How to Move Your Mom and Still Be on Speaking Terms Afterward provides in-depth conversations with professionals, older adults, and their family members who share their stories with warmth, understanding, and humor. I'm your host, Marty Stevens-Heebner, and here you'll find answers to many of your questions, as well as different perspectives that I hope will inform and inspire you. Welcome, Lisa. So great to have you here.
Thank you so much, Marty. It's wonderful to be here.
Thank you. And it's going to be great talking to you about what you've personally experienced, as well as what you do professionally with your clients. Here's a little something about Lisa. She has served hundreds of families of diverse needs as a senior care consultant, as well as an Alzheimer's and dementia placement specialist. Her life's work is advocacy for caregivers and compassionate placement for their loved ones. Lisa created Gently Guided to help families transition forward with compassion. Families feel peace of mind as she takes the burden of feeling alone off of their shoulders. She also serves on the Public Policy Committee for Alzheimer's Los Angeles. When it comes to being a caregiver, Lisa truly gets it because she became a caregiver herself when her husband Gary was diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's in 2012. And he just passed away, wasn't it, during 2020?
Yes, April in 2020.
He was fortunate to have such a caring wife taking care of him. That's wonderful. So I like to ask, what's your favorite memory of your grandparents?
I would say that there were a lot of memories, and mainly with my mom's parents, and we called them Grandma and Papa, and they lived not too far from us. My grandfather, about the time I was born, had a stroke at 59 and lived for almost 30 years.
Wow.
My grandmother's whole world was taking care of him. So they relied on the family because resources didn't exist back then. But she always had lots of cookies and she gave great back rubs. And she was just one of the most giving, loving people I've ever known in my whole life. Less than 5 feet tall.
She was a spark plug.
But it was also something intuitive of me that I recognized. One, stroke is maybe genetically my thing growing up. So it was also instilled in me that I need to take care of myself.
Yeah.
And I watched her suffer. We all watched her suffer. He needed a lot of care and he shuffled around and lived in the past mainly.
Those long-term memories, they managed to stick around.
Yeah. And he had, because of the stroke, it was more vascular dementia where they can come and go a little more. It's very different. So that was a huge window into the future, little did I know.
Yeah. Speaking about what you saw your grandmother go through taking care of your grandfather, and of course, your own experience with your husband, Gary, I actually wrote a blog called The Exhausted Caregiver. And it's so important to find a way to take care of yourself. I don't mean that in a selfish kind of way, just to maintain your sanity.
Absolutely. My husband, Gary, did have Alzheimer's. He was 55, but we didn't know what it was exactly. You know, it took 7 years to get a diagnosis.
So young.
So young. And I think times have changed since 2005 tremendously. We still have a lot of room to grow as far as diagnoses go, but he was still young and vibrant. And he never had a good sense of direction.
Hello. That's me too.
Right? He did lose his keys occasionally. So the little things, you would just go, whoa, what's that? It was really confusing. And I think when it's your spouse, it's very different than a parent or a grandparent because it's your partner and the person you lean on for everything and is there and not. He was independent for a very long time, but a lot of things happened. He lost 2 jobs in 2 years. 4 times in 3 years, a very confusing time.
I can only imagine. And it must have been so hard on you. Also, when it's your spouse, you realize you're close in age. So that has to throw you for a loop as well. You understand your parents having this happen.
At the same time, my mother had dementia, but when it's your spouse, denial's a powerful thing. It protects us. And it's really hard because the stakes are so high. And you might have a little thing, and I would just say, oh no, please not that.
Oh, yeah. Yes, of course.
But at the same time, as a family caregiver, or I wasn't even calling myself a family caregiver back then, you're beginning to overcompensate without even knowing it.
In what ways?
Taking charge, making decisions. It's the beginning of thinking for 2 people at the same time, 2 brains at the same time. And over time, that just increases. On the other hand, your loved one is overcompensating, trying to cover or maintain or keep up. It's the beginning of this kind of stress.
So you took care of your mother who had vascular dementia and also your dear husband who had Alzheimer's. What are the subtle differences between caring for a parent versus your spouse, your husband?
Well, I would say we go back to the personalities. There's the saying, if you've met one person with Alzheimer's, you've met one person with Alzheimer's, right?
So true.
My mother was really easy and she trusted me. My father became ill with lymphoma in 2005. That was a fairly quick illness, and her dependency on him transferred to me. And so she lived with us for about 6 months. And then we moved her into assisted living. My sister and I did.
And let's talk about your professional work.
All right.
Gently Guided.
Yeah.
Talk about the focus of your work, because that dovetails nicely with finding the assisted living for your mother.
Well, Gently Guided, we provide senior living options for families at no charge. And over the years, I have evolved into an Alzheimer's and dementia placement specialist. I've been doing this work for about 9 years now.
And you're so good at it. Your personality is so warm. You're clear about what you do. And having lived through it, it must be, in a way, a relief when your clients understand that you've lived through it yourself. And so have that personal insight into it.
It's an instant connection. And they'll say, oh my gosh, I'm so glad you get it. And there's not a lot I haven't seen over the years. There's patterns that you see. Everybody may be different, but the way it shows up in many ways, there are patterns to it.
Can you describe those patterns a little bit? That's fascinating.
I'll just shift over to once someone is diagnosed, it becomes, I believe, less of a medical issue and now it becomes a quality of life issue. And you're wanting to match that with that person's personality. Are they social? Are they introverted? What environment are they going to be thriving in? And I like to think of myself as a matchmaker. And because we're such a small company, there's only 3 of us, and we're very hands-on. We have great relationships with our providers, and that instills a lot of trust for our families. So we're not bombarding them with a lot of options. I may give them 3 or less. Sometimes there's only 1 available, but we don't want to overwhelm them. We're here to take it off their shoulders and give them some peace of mind.
I know that there are, shall we say, large corporate entities that advertise a lot on TV, who have these big platforms. What's the difference between dealing with a company like that versus working with you?
We always try to say, stay off the internet searching too much. And it can be very tricky. Most of the people that work for these companies have never set foot in any of the options in the area.
The board and cares and the assisted living that have memory care areas.
And they don't necessarily tour with their clients either. They're not as hands-on, and it's not fair. A family is so overwhelmed to begin with that they don't need a list of 10 or 20 options that may not be an appropriate match to begin with. We offer a personalized service, a very concierge service.
Really listening a lot to understand the subtleties. And again, you've gone through it yourself.
The beauty of our business is that we're referral by referral. So our referrals come from professionals, attorneys, fiduciaries, other communities, so that when someone calls, one of the first things they usually say is, you come highly recommended. And we're off and running.
It really is shepherding, isn't it? Because people are often desperate is a strong word, but sometimes they really are desperate to find any kind of help that they can trust to lead them through this dark tunnel.
It's frustrating. It's confusing. They're overwhelmed. They're dealing with so many different things at the same time. I evolved into this work because I was trying to find purpose and meaning for myself, because nothing makes sense if you're dealing with a loved one and living with a loved one with Alzheimer's or dementia. Logic is now out the window. You have to find a way to cope. And it's so frustrating. At one point, soon after Gary was diagnosed, I ended up having to call 911 on myself. My heart rate was so high. I was just so stressed out. And you're thinking, here come the paramedics. I remember them coming in and I'm saying, my husband has Alzheimer's and he needs attention too. And we left the house. I left my purse, my cell, because no one's looking out for the caregiver.
Not for you. Yeah.
And that was a huge wake-up call, because the doctor came in the next morning and said to me, you need to make some changes. This is a long journey. He was like an angel showing up in that room that day. And it hit me right between the eyes and made me realize that this is a long journey and I had to take care of myself.
What did he recommend to you?
He didn't really recommend anything. He scared the heck out of me. But at the same time, I was in a hospital bed with an IV of Ativan saying, wow, this is like a vacation. And what's wrong with that picture, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Right?
Who's taking care of the caregiver? And you lead some support groups.
I lead a support group through the Kensington, and
the Kensington, which is actually an assisted living community.
Living and memory care. That's correct. They're fantastic. We are open to anyone who has a family member or loved one that has Alzheimer's or dementia.
And that's so important, because you're just saying who's looking after the caregiver, and you were in that situation. Yeah. And this way, with the support group, people trade numbers, they help each other, and you just know you're not alone.
It's a community. We have a core group that is amazing, and we're peer-to-peer. When they were asking me to be a facilitator for this support group, I said, I can't, I'm one of them. And they said, well, that's why we want you. And it's turned out to be one of the most fulfilling things I've ever done in my life. It's incredible. And we just had someone find us from New York.
Wow.
Right.
That is so challenging when you live somewhere else. My dad lived in Buffalo. About the only thing that wasn't wrong with him was his mind. Sometimes to my chagrin, he did have all his faculties to the end. But trying to help take care of him from Los Angeles when he's in Buffalo, I went back and forth a lot. But it must have been such a relief when that person from New York spoke to you and realized that, here's support.
Yes, that feels really good. We welcome anyone that comes into the group.
Let's talk about some of the work that you do for Alzheimer's Greater Los Angeles.
My husband Gary's symptoms started very subtly in 2005. He started having these episodes in about 2007. He'd get pressure and hot and cold, and it was affecting his short-term memory. So we started seeing a neurologist, and they just said, must be seizures. And we saw another neurologist, same thing, because he was so young. He was 57 by then. And it just continued slowly. Then he lost his job in 2010.
And this was because
performance issues, he couldn't keep up. There were little signs. He had gotten lost a couple of times. And then we moved several times. He took another job, and that lasted about 6 months. Something was definitely wrong. He went to a neuropsychologist for testing, and they diagnosed MCI, mild cognitive impairment. We were referred to neurologist number 3. That's how we got the diagnosis in late 2012. So that took 7 years to get to that point.
Wow.
And at that point, both of us were scrambling and struggling. He was overcompensating with blame and humor, which can only go so far. Very, very stressful on both of us. Financially, we were bleeding money, just a lot of costs. And so once he got the diagnosis, it was like, oh my gosh, we had an answer. So I reached out to a support group in the local area. It was a general support group. Immediately, I knew that I needed something specific. I was told there was a support group through Alzheimer's Los Angeles. I reached out, and we actually had to wait for a support group to form for enough people. That was their memory club. We both went. Gary went kicking and screaming. There's a lot of shame with this big stigma.
And embarrassment, because I'm sure he's used to being this very functioning individual.
He had been a real estate attorney, a real estate broker, very intelligent, very smart, well-read. This was the worst insult and the scariest diagnosis. He didn't want to share. And I just started negotiating. Can I tell one person? Can I tell two? But we ended up going to Memory Club, and the design of their meetings are you have an educational hour, and then the next hour you split up and they go with the diagnosed and the caregivers go into their own group. And it's fantastic.
I was going to say, that's a great idea.
And he loved it, because they could relate to one another. They could talk about it. They could talk about their feelings. They could talk about their fears. They could learn new tools to cope. There are tools that you can do. And he downloaded the apps to stimulate his brain. So there were a lot of things he could do, and it gave me an outlet too.
Oh, I bet.
It gave us a social life too.
And I'm sure it's such a relief for both of you. Let's talk about some of the work you do for Alzheimer's Los Angeles. Yeah. You're a public policy advocate.
Caregiver Advocate. That's part of the service, to make sure that the caregiver is really taking care of themselves. It gave Gary and I a purpose, and we actually advocated for public policy. Gary and I actually went up to Sacramento. He testified before a Senate hearing committee and helped pass a bill.
Wow. And that's at the state level in California.
He was able to convey how this disease had affected him. It was really powerful. He was really proud of himself, because he always said, I want to be part of the solution and not part of the problem. It's very brave.
Very brave. He had Alzheimer's, but that was something he could do because he had Alzheimer's. Do you remember what the policy was that got passed?
Yes, it was asking doctors to make sure they hand out resources to those who are diagnosed or experiencing cognitive decline.
Nothing worse, I can only imagine, than being given that diagnosis and saying, okay, thanks, bye-bye.
That's a whole other subject, because Alzheimer's and dementia goes against everything a doctor ever learned in medical school.
In what way?
There's no cure, there's no treatment, there's no protocol. It's very ambiguous, and it's emotional.
Oh, yeah.
So it's very awkward. It's hard. It's hard for everyone.
It really is. And I'm curious, with not just Gary, but your other relatives, did you notice change in their personalities? Yeah. Can you give me an example of that?
They just start getting quieter because they can't keep up with certain conversations. The world starts becoming a little more overwhelming to them. There's subtle changes, and the filters go off too. So you never know what might come out of the mouth of babes, right? Yeah. And they start focusing differently. There are certain stages. I put everything in basically 3 stages of early stage, where you really want them to thrive. That's the time to really catch it, so that they can maintain that cognitive level for as long as possible to be stimulated.
Yeah. And what do you start seeing with mid-stage dementia?
More care needs, showering, bathing, grooming, dressing. That's a hard bridge to cross, because they're used to being independent. To maintain someone's dignity throughout the process is so key.
And in late stage dementia, there's an obvious and profound disconnection for obvious reasons. That's the disease. Mm-hmm. But people forget that there's still life in there.
Oh, yeah.
What kinds of things did you do, and do you encourage your clients to do, to keep people as present as possible for as long as possible?
It's just really important to be present with them. There is no greater teacher to be in the present moment than this disease, because that's where they are. They're in the present moment. And if we meet them in that moment with compassion and patience, it's amazing what happens. They thrive in calm environments, safe environments, trusting environments, because it's scary to lose control. And at some level, they are very aware that they're losing control.
And trying to understand it.
With the anxiety, if they become overwhelmed, they're losing control. They may not be able to speak their words anymore. Their feelings may be confused.
Things are bottled up because they can't articulate what they're feeling.
That's right. So the anxiety can show up in a lot of different ways.
Another thing, in addition to being a place where they can trust people, it's also about being accepted wherever they are, because sometimes they think you're the daughter or with somebody who's older, their husband who passed away 20 years ago, and not telling them that he's been dead for however long, but rather just being there and for that moment, being in their story.
It's their journey, not our journey.
That's beautifully put.
We want to follow them on their journey and to create that story so that they have peace of mind. I was fascinated towards the end of Gary's life. Gary knew me. He knew his daughters when he went on hospice. He was on hospice for 6 months. And I asked them, how many of your patients have Alzheimer's or dementia of some sort? And they said about half.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, how many of your patients recognize their loved ones? And they said about half. And I thought that was really amazing.
That is extraordinary.
Mm-hmm. Because there's that belief they don't recognize you anymore. And they may not, but your essence is there. And we're human beings. Just because we can't communicate, we're still there.
It's so important to be yourself, especially if you're a family member, and as much as you can be given the situation, because it's not just what you look like. That is you, like you said, the essence. If you're behaving differently, you'll seem like a stranger.
Mm-hmm.
I remember actually being at the board and care your husband was at towards the end. And it was such a nice, peaceful place. And he was calm and peaceful. And that was lovely. You gave that to him.
Yeah, that was important.
It was important. So as things progress with Gary and with your clients and their loved ones, I'm sure people have to go in and out of the hospital or a rehabilitation facility. What do people need to go in for?
That is a great question, because that's an adventure all of its own. When someone with Alzheimer's or dementia has to go into the hospital, they don't know why they're there. Very confusing for them, because now they're in a new environment. It's really tough if they have to have an IV or need assistance of any kind. I remember Gary had to be in the hospital for a little over a week. I couldn't leave the room until a nurse or doctor came in to either change him or do some procedure on him, and then I could take a break. Even then, the doctors or a nurse, even if simple thing of taking them to the restroom or having them shower, they don't realize they don't know how to do that by themselves necessarily, or that they need assistance with that every step of the way. So I found myself training them or just trying to share with them how to approach him and that he needed more assistance. This is why I do what I do, because I didn't have somebody like me along the way to show me. I want to be there for somebody as I would have wanted somebody there to be with me. There are resources we don't even know that they're there. It's really about learning how to ask for things and how to navigate around that. And that's the most confusing part. The same goes for skilled nursing facilities and rehab as well. Sometimes hospitals have sitters. You can hire them.
What do you love about what you do?
I love the relationships from the providers that we work with, and then the families that I work with. We get into some amazingly deep conversations. We're just sharing and we're talking and we're understanding, because not everybody understands the world of a family caregiver who has to deal with that day in and day out. Sometimes people on the outside, even if they're a family member, if they're not directly involved in it, they don't quite understand. They can have opinions and suggestions, but unless you're in it, nobody really gets it and how difficult it is. There was a book that I read several years ago called Loving Someone Who Has Dementia by Dr. Pauline Boss. It's all about the caregiver. Even though it was written several years ago, one of the first things she says in the book is that 63% of caregivers pass away before their loved one does. And that hit me right between the eyes. I have taken that seriously. You can't take care of yourself enough. You have to take care of your own health, or you'll go down the tube and now where are you? That's the important part. But I love the sharing, love the connection and the fulfillment of finding that right match for a family.
A right community for them. Yeah.
And knowing that I'm part of our greater community where my services are trusted, that's such a rewarding feeling, knowing that. As you will agree, our working worlds are very small and tight-knit. We rely on each other as resources because who are we without our resources? We can't educate enough.
My big goal with this podcast is to get people talking and thinking about it and sharing expertise, whether you're a professional working with older adults and their families or as a caregiver at home emotionally, just knowing you're not the only one. I guess it's like child rearing and that every day is different.
That's right. I used to feel like I could just barely get oxygen. Some of my darkest days, and I talk about this with other family caregivers, I'm feeling like I was living in a phone booth on the sidewalk, watching the world pass me by. The isolation is really detrimental. It's so easy to become isolated and see people going on with their lives. Literally, I'm just now learning to have a life. You have to relearn and re-enter the world. That's something that you never get over. That's the bond we all share.
And all these things, they happen.
Yeah.
And it's not going to go back to normal. It will be a new kind of normal because so much has changed as a result. What do you wish people knew about the work you do? And what kind of questions should they be asking someone if they're interviewing people who do placement?
Well, I think it's really important to create a circle of trusted advisors for yourself. My coaching background helps me with listening and being present for people and really taking a stand that they honor themselves as they move through this process. I think it's so important to trust yourself, and you can lose sight of that. It's so important to stay connected any way you can with your own intuition because there's no map. There are no instructions. So you have to figure it out as best you can to move through it because there's no right answer. The guilt, the torment of making that decision to place your loved one is probably the hardest decision you'll ever have to make in your whole life.
And yet finding that perfect community where you can place them is such a relief.
And many times families are at odds with their opinion, and there's a lot of things that are happening at the same time. I believe being a caregiver is a leadership position. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps.
You were a professional certified coach.
Yes.
For 25 years. People are completely baffled. And so often the huge mass of emotions that surround this end up triggering bickering and fights and everything.
It's almost like people's unresolved childhood issues can come up in the dynamics of this. It is the opportunity to heal if you can be open to that. Say it's a son or a daughter watching this parent decline. It's giving up that role of being the child and stepping into more of a parent role. Some people go through it naturally and some people can't see it. Some people struggle with it, but somebody has to take charge.
Yes. As the adult child, you go from being the one cared for to the one caring for the parent. Right. You were dependent on them. Now they're dependent on you, whether they want to be or not.
And we see all types of different qualities of relationships that have happened. Sometimes they didn't get along so well, yet they are entrusted with the care of a loved one. All of this journey as a family caregiver has a huge part of ambiguous loss, grief. Dr. Boss's book is all about ambiguous loss because it's grief without closure. And you have to learn to live in uncertainty. If there's anything I've practiced in the last 16 years is living in uncertainty. It's a great practice because it's not easy, but it's walking that tightrope of being in the present moment as much as possible.
Mindfulness. Lisa, thank you so much for your openness and for all the extraordinary work you do.
Thank you, Marty.
Thank you so much for listening to How to Move Your Mom and Still Be on Speaking Terms Afterward. Please visit howtomoveyourmom.com for more information about this episode and for additional podcast episodes featuring other extraordinary guests and conversations. Until next time, this is your very grateful host, Marty Stevens-Huebner.